All right, this is the endocrine system video. The endocrine system is consists of glands and hormones. It's the second great control system of the body. So we think of the nervous system as kind of controlling what our body does, but the endocrine system is just as important in controlling the activities of all sorts of different body parts. So again, I'll talk about the function and anatomy of the endocrine system briefly, and then I'll go over the word parts that are associated with the endocrine system and give you some examples. Of course, there are plenty more terms that you'll have to know for the exam, besides what I go over. So what's the function of the endocrine system? Well, it's almost too complex to really talk about. There's so many different functions. It controls things like hunger, thirst, your sexual drive, reproductive capabilities and activities, blood pressure, growth and development, regulates blood glucose levels, helps regulate blood pressure, all sorts of stuff. As a control system, it differs from the nervous system in that it is a little slower to respond, but the effects of the endocrine system last much longer than the effects of the nervous system. So the nervous system can respond very quickly, but as soon as it stops sending information, then the effects are lost. So in other words, for example, if you contract a muscle, as soon as you stop sending signals through the nervous system to contract that muscle, the muscle relaxes immediately. Conversely, you can secrete a hormone, and that hormone can have an effect in the body for hours to weeks after you stop sending that hormone. That brings us to hormones. So as mentioned before, glands produce hormones. Hormones are chemicals that are released into the bloodstream and travel to the bloodstream throughout the body to have their effects on target tissues. Target tissues have to have a specific receptor for that hormone, or they just ignore it. It's like it wasn't even there. Hormones go everywhere in the body, but only affect certain specific tissues. There are a few hormones that can affect just about any tissue because just about all tissues have receptors for that hormone. But most usually, hormones affect a certain set of tissues or even just one specific tissue that has the receptors for that hormone. What I'm showing you here is the endocrine system and the major glands. These are glands whose, I'll say, day job is to create hormones. There are other tissues in the body that create hormones and have a role in the endocrine system, but they have other more important jobs, or at least they have a day job. It's kind of their side gig is producing hormones. I'll give you an example. The stomach produces hormones. The small intestines produce hormones. The kidneys produce hormones. The day job of the kidneys is to make urine, but they also have an endocrine function. So there's lots of other tissues that have endocrine functions. These are the ones whose main responsibility is endocrine. So if we start up here at the top, kind of buried in the deep brain here, the hypothalamus is the connection between the nervous tissue. It is part of the brain itself, but it also secretes hormones. So it's got one foot in the neurological world and one foot in the endocrine world. And that's how the two great control systems of the body kind of interact with each other so they're on the same page. So that's part of how they communicate is through the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sometimes is referred to as kind of the master control. It has certain nervous system and certain endocrine functions that help control all sorts of parts of the body. Then you move down a little bit, hanging off the bottom of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. And it's sometimes referred to as the hypophysis because it's hanging below the body of the hypothalamus. And it's actually two glands in one. It's an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary, and they each have specific hormones that they secrete. A lot of the hormones they secrete will control other glands. And you'll get into that when you get into the full-on terminology in this chapter. Moving on down, we have the thyroid gland. It sits just underneath the thyroid cartilage here, kind of across the trachea, embedded in the back of the thymus gland. So here we're looking at the posterior aspect. You see these four little patches. These are the parathyroid glands. Moving a little deeper into the chest, you have the thymus, which is really only active during childhood up through adolescence, and by adulthood, and certainly later adulthood, it's pretty much atrophied into kind of a fibrous mass. It doesn't function much after you reach adulthood. Moving on down, these little caps on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. You can see it. It's hidden here on the left, but on the right you can see the adrenal gland pretty clearly. They're on both kidneys. And in the middle here is the pancreas. The pancreas has endocrine roles. It also will show up again in the digestive system for its exocrine roles. Moving on down to the gonads, you have the male gonads are the testes, which sit in the scrotum. And then in the female, you have the ovaries, which are up in the abdomen. So let's talk about the word parts. Adeno refers to gland. That means a gland. So if you have an adenoma, that is a mass or a tumor of a gland. Adenopathy would be a disease of a gland. Adreno, with the R, refers specifically to the adrenal gland. Adrenal means towards the kidney. It's the gland that sits right on top of the kidney. So it could be adreno or adrenalo. So adrenarche is a stage of puberty in females when the adrenal gland starts producing certain sex hormones. Adrenalitis would be an inflammation of the adrenal gland. Cortico. So the adrenal gland is actually two glands in one. The outer covering of the adrenal gland is the adrenal cortex. Cortex means the outer portion. And it acts as one gland, whereas the middle, the adrenal medulla, acts as a second type of gland. So really the adrenal gland is two glands in one. When you see cortico, in this context, they're referring to the adrenal cortex. Corticotropic is a suffix you'll see later on that means stimulating. So this is a hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex. And it's usually referred to as adrenocorticotropic, just to make it very clear that you're talking about the adrenal cortex. You could have adrenocorticohyperplasia, which is a mouthful. Plasia, condition of growth or development. Hyper means too much. So this is too much growth in the adrenal cortex, and so it tends to overproduce its hormones. The gonads, I think you're familiar with. So gonado refers to either the testes in the male or the ovaries in the female. So gonadopathy means a disease of the gonads. Gonadogenesis occurs during embryonic development and it refers specifically to when the gonads either go down the road to becoming testes or go down the road to becoming ovaries. Pancreato, of course, refers to the pancreas. So you could have pancreatitis, which is an inflammation of the pancreas, or you could have a stone in the pancreas, pancreatolith. As I mentioned before, the pituitary is also called the hypophysis. So both pituitaro and hypophysio refer to the pituitary gland. Hyperpituitarism, sometimes called gigantism, is an overproduction of growth hormone. So it's too much pituitary activity. Hypophysitis is an inflammation of the pituitary gland. Hypophysitis. Thymo refers to the thymus. The thymus gland is mostly concerned with the development of certain types of white blood cells. But a thymoma would be a mass on the thymus. Thymectomy would be removal of it. Thyro and thyroido both refer to the thyroid gland. It has a couple different hormones that it secretes, one being thyroid hormone, which regulates your metabolic rate, and the other one being calcitonin, which regulates blood calcium levels. So thyrotoxin is any chemical that damages the thyroid. Thyroidectomy, of course, would be a removal of the thyroid gland. Glucoso, and glyco all mean sugar. And the reason they're being brought up in this particular chapter is that the pancreas secretes two hormones that regulate blood glucose levels, insulin and glucagon. Insulin reduces blood glucose levels. Glucagon is secreted in between meals to raise blood glucose levels so that you maintain blood glucose levels at the very narrow range 24/7, regardless of when you last ate. The other reason, I guess, is that the adrenal cortex produces hormones called glucocorticoids. Gluco tells you that it regulates glucose, and corticoid means that it is released by the adrenal cortex. If you have glucoseuria, that means you have glucose in your urine, which under normal circumstances you should never have. Hypoglycemia, you may have heard that term. So it's a condition of low glucose. It literally means blood glucose. Your blood glucose is lower than normal, and for some reason it's not being brought back up by glucagon. Crino is in this chapter because it means to secrete. Endocrine means to secrete inside, specifically inside the blood. Exocrine are secretions to the outside of the body, things like sweat and milk. Those are exocrine secretions. I mentioned before, tropin is a special type of hormone that has its effects. Its target tissue is only other glands. So thyrotropin is a hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland. Gonadotropins are hormones that stimulate the gonads. Emia, of course, refers to blood. So we have glycemia, is blood sugar, and calcemia is blood calcium. And urea means urine. So polyuria means not many urines, but lots of urine.